I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners back to order for Tuesday, June 26, 2018. And we are in our afternoon session, and I want to note for the record that both Commissioner Williams and Commissioner Sorensen are excused this afternoon, so it's just the three of us this afternoon. And our first item of business is item 11A, which is a public hearing in order 2607 in the matter of annexing territory to the Dexter Sanitary District to provide sewer service to the annexed territory, and Assessor's Map 1901-1620, tax lot number 100. And we have Rachel, and correct me if I'm wrong, Surslev?
That's correct, yeah.
So turn it over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Bozovich, and good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Rachel Surslev, a staff planner for this application. And the request before you today is for the annexation of a single lot, a 2.5 acre tax lot into the Dexter Sanitary District. This petition was initiated pursuant to RS 198.857 for annexation of a property by a single property owner, and pursuant to LC Board Order 07-12-12-19, which provides guidance for processing applications related to special district boundaries. Public notice required by ORS 198 and the board order was posted, published, and mailed, and as of today, no comments have been received. Generally, the subject property is located northeast of Highway 58 in the unincorporated community of Dexter. The western property line abuts boundaries of the sanitary district, and other properties in the district lie in the vicinity to the east and south of the subject property. The applicant, Walt Zajac, owns the subject property that contains a 1946 single-family dwelling. Approval of this request will enable the dwelling on the subject property to conform to the standards of a dwelling to be legal and habitable. Dwellings must have indoor plumbing connected to a sanitary waste disposal system in order to conform to building codes and be considered a legal and habitable dwelling. Annexation of the subject property to the Dexter Sanitary District will ensure that the dwelling has proper sanitary waste disposal and will meet the requirements of Lane Code. The applicant has provided information and findings addressing the approval criteria in his application, and in past practice, staff has accepted written confirmation from the special district attesting to the that the annexed property can be served by the facilities or services provided by the district. In this case, the Dexter Sanitary District has voted to approve the requested annexation. This is evidenced with resolution dated December 11, 2017, provided on page 18 of attachment 2 in your packet. However, given the history of Dexter Sanitary District, concerns have been raised about the capacity of the current system in place. And since these concerns were raised, staff has pursued information regarding the impact of adding an additional property to the district. Staff had contacted representatives from the Dexter Sanitary District and the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and through phone conversations, neither entity has expressed concern regarding the capacity of the system and the ability for it to uphold another property. And therefore, staff recommends that you approve the annexation to the special district, and that concludes staff presentation.
Thank you. So before we open the public hearing, are there any questions for staff from the board? So I just want to explore staff finding two a little bit more, which is about whether the property can be served, because I was want to pass that concern on to you, and I have Mr. Ramirez from our Economic Development Department standing by maybe to provide background. But in the past, we have provided funding for the district to try and develop some planning documents around how to repair their system, because it is in disrepair and exceeds capacity in wet weather conditions, and there are issues with groundwater contamination, possible groundwater contamination. I think some of the people refuse to have their wells tested, so some of it's just, you know, not not confirmed. There are some areas where they have confirmed it. So I'm a little concerned about this application because I know that they're now trying to put together the funding a second time to carry out the study that they were supposed to get done the first time, which kind of just, unfortunately, the consultant at that time had health issues and didn't get completed. So I'm a little surprised DEQ gave you the answer they did, because I thought that this system was under some kind of order from DEQ about repair, but maybe I'm remembering it incorrectly. But if maybe you could review that a little bit more, and if necessary, if you need information historically on what we've been doing through our economic development department at trying to assist this particular district in getting their system functional, Mr. Ramirez is available also to answer questions too. So could you, we got a request to add more, effluent to a system that I know is already having capacity and repair issues.
Sure. So I can summarize the conversation that I had with DEQ and a staff member at DEQ this morning, and it was basically that there is no longer a moratorium on the system from what he told me, but they do have an agreement, the Dexter Sanitary District has an agreement with DEQ about how they are managing their flow and the bacteria levels. And so I think it has been an agreement with DEQ and the sanitary system to kind of work together to address the issues. So I can't really speak in detail to that just because I don't have that technical expertise, but from what I understood, they're working together to manage it, and I don't think he expressed any concern about adding a single additional property to the district in terms of could it be served by the system. But he did recognize that there were issues, and I believe that the district and DEQ are trying to work together to solve those issues.
Okay, so they did lift the moratorium, but they're under an agreement as far as how to best manage this. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a typical rural system that was built a long time ago and built to what we would not consider modern sanitary standards. They basically disconnected, drainage fields from septic tanks and redirected it to the system. And a lot of those connections between the septic tanks and the system have failed. And I hope as they plan to serve this new home that they are going to directly connect the home versus trying to redirect the septic tank connection, because that's one of the places they're having a lot of issues. So I guess I've had my technical question about whether there's actually a legal basis to around the criteria on that particular ORS answered. Sounds like we don't need to hear the economic development history if DEQ has lifted their moratorium and they're okay with it. I can't argue with DEQ. I just have history of hearing about this system over the years. So I just wanted to make sure that we were indeed okay under that one particular section of ORS that says that the affected territory can be reasonably served and continue to be served by facilities or services provided by the district. And we're taking that DEQ approval as meeting that requirement.
Yeah,
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair, for bringing that up. I hadn't heard about that for a number of years, but my understanding wasn't a system of capacity, it was more a connection issue that I heard about a number of years ago. So maybe that's why DEQ was able to, I'm speculating, that seems that that would probably be DEQ's response is more localized rather than systemic. So.
And I don't think I would call it a DEQ approval because this was just a phone conversation that I had with someone there. But if the applicant has suggested that they meet that criteria, and I verified with both the district who approved the annexation and verified with DEQ, and none of those entities think that it's an issue in terms of capacity, I guess that's the best I can do for providing that information.
It would be difficult for us to write a finding against that, based on the fact that their district board has approved that, saying that they could serve, and DEQ hasn't expressed a concern that they can continue to serve. So I won't press that issue further. I just wanted to clarify that, because that was the one thing that was of concern of mine. So I do need to hold a public hearing on this. So I would like to open the public hearing for Order 1806-2607 in the matter of annexing territory to the Dexter Sanitary District to provide sewer service. And is there anyone that's been signed up to speak at the public hearing back there, Dan? And is there anyone here present that wants to speak to this issue? Seeing and hearing none, I will close the public hearing for this issue and then turn to my board members for deliberations and possible motion. Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just move approval of Order 1806-2607, the matter of annexing territory to the Dexter Sanitary District to provide sewer service to the annexed territory. Assessors Map 1901-1620, Tax Lot 00100.
Second.
It's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Farr. Any discussion to the motion? Just want to thank staff for clarifying those issues for me about service. If there's no discussion to the motion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The motion passes 3-0 with Commissioners Williams and Sorensen excused. Thank you. So that moves us on to item B, which is the second reading and public hearing for Ordinance 1805 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 10 to implement accessory dwelling unit standards within the urbanizable areas outside of the Metro Plan boundary as enabled by ORS 197.3125, adopting a savings and severability clauses, and declaring an emergency. That's County File Number 509 PA 1805334. And a second reading and public hearing on Ordinance Number 1806 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 10 to co-adopt accessory dwelling unit standards for the urbanizing areas between the city limits and the urban growth boundary of the city of Springfield, and as enabled by ORS 197.3125, adopting savings and severability clauses and declaring an emergency, and that's file number 509 PA 1805365. And we have Keir Miller and the rest of staff here. So Keir, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Bozovich, and good afternoon, Commissioners. This afternoon, the Board will be holding public hearings on 3 separate ordinances. These ordinances, if adopted, will implement code language that would allow the placement of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, in the unincorporated urbanizing areas of Lane County. Pursuant to Senate Bill 1051, which is codified at ORS 197.312 sub 5, cities with a population of over 2,500 residents must allow an area zoned for single-family residences the development of at least one accessory dwelling unit for each detached single-family dwelling. As the Board is aware, this legislation was enacted to help address the shortage and variety of available housing types within the state. The first ordinance before you, 10-05, would amend Lane Code Chapter 10 to implement accessory dwelling unit standards within the urbanizing areas of the smaller cities in Lane County. Currently, this includes the cities of Cottage Grove, Cresswell, Florence, Junction City, and Oak Ridge. The remainder of cities either don't meet the 2,500 resident threshold or they have no urbanizing areas outside of their incorporated limits. Lane County Planning Commission held a work session concerning the proposed amendments to Lane Code Chapter 10 on May 1st. There was no public testimony at that hearing, and the LCPC unanimously passed the motion recommending that the Board adopt the proposed amendments. Ordinance number 18-06 would amend Lane Code to co-adopt by reference amendments to the Springfield Development Code, enabling ADUs outside of the City of Springfield's incorporated areas, but within the city's urban growth boundary. The Lane County Planning Commission held a work session on the proposed amendments to the Springfield Development Code on May 1st, and on May 8th, a joint public hearing with the Springfield and Lane County Planning Commissions was held. During this hearing, 3 individuals spoke in favor of the proposed amendments. At the conclusion of the hearing, the LCPC passed a unanimous recommendation that the board adopt the proposed language. On June 25th, last night, the Springfield City Council unanimously adopted the proposed ADU standards within the city's urbanizing areas. Ordinance number 18-04, which concerns the City of Eugene's accessory dwelling unit standards, is item 11C, which is next on your agenda, and Staff Planner Lindsay Eichner will be providing details on that application. At this time, I'm available for any questions.
So questions for staff on this issue before the public hearing?
Thank you.
Commissioner Farr?
How long do we have? Actually, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail today, but, Keir, can you talk just a little bit, if you can, if you have any information on how the discussion at the Planning Commissions has incorporated DLCD guideline recommendations?
So the DLCD guideline document, which you're referencing, was included as attachments to the Planning Commission, and staff did point out the recommendations in that language when we were drafting the county's proposals within the urbanizing areas. And it was followed fairly closely from the county perspective, and there was robust discussion around it. I know for which Ms. Eichner can discuss in more detail about the City of Eugene's proposal. But for the most part, staff's efforts at the county level was to implement and incorporate that language to the best of our ability to enable accessory dwelling units. So I think the discussion was, wide-ranging, and it covered all of the topics. There's a number of things that were presented in the state's proposal, which I think the county's Chapter 10 language, as well as the City of Springfield's language from the onset, sort of incorporated most of that. And I think, as you'll hear over the course of the conversation with the Planning Commission, the Eugene proposal evolved as well to meet most of those sort of guidelines.
Okay, I'll have a couple of specific questions. I'm really interested in moving forward with allowing ADUs in a much less restrictive fashion than we have, both in Eugene and in Oregon in general, and understanding the DLCD guidelines are simply guidelines and not the law and not requirements. Some of the things that they say in there, I guess I'll have questions right now regarding how has this been talked about. For instance, requiring off-street parking is one of the biggest barriers to developing ADUs. What discussion has been had regarding off-street parking?
In the context of the Lane Code Chapter 10 proposal, so of the 3 proposals, the one that deals with the small cities, which is the one that was just read into the record right now, there was no discussion of off-street parking as a concern for or against allowing ADUs, so it didn't factor into the discussion at all.
Okay, but so without going into too much detail in the documents, current guidelines typically, or not guidelines, but rules typically require off-street parking. And DLCD is saying, let's see, quote, one of the biggest barriers to developing ADUs. So I'm interested in a discussion specifically saying how do we get around having off-street parking and how do we make it easier to develop ADUs. Now, of course, nobody's interested in destroying neighborhood integrity. But some of the things that DLCD is suggesting, I sat here in a public hearing with the City of Eugene and heard a number of people testifying that really it sounded very specifically against some of the things that DLCD is recommending. So, owner occupancy, for instance. It says requiring owners to live on the property, difficult to enforce and not recommended. So what discussion's been had regarding owner occupancy?
So let me back up and clarify a little bit. Maybe this will help address the concern around parking. I just want to make it clear that the codes before you, for the the Lane Code Chapter 10, as well as I believe, and Ms. Eichner can clarify when she comes up to speak about the City of Eugene, we've removed any requirements for off-street parking, so that should not be an obstacle to ADUs.
And, okay, so I just use those two examples as simply examples. The list goes on regarding design standards and various things that I would hope and expect that municipalities and counties would take a really an in-depth look at recommendations of DLCD and really, truly make an effort to have ADUs allowable.
And if I may just dive in, I think when Mr. Miller was drafting the standards for Chapter 10, he was reviewing those guidelines very closely. And so again, we don't have a requirement for parking for ADUs. We don't have an owner occupancy requirement for ADUs. So I think the codes before you really do comport with the DLCD guidelines, and so maybe that's why there was less of a discussion with the Planning Commission about this particular chapter. Again, when we talked to you with Ms. Eichner about the City of Eugene, there was a robust discussion, and so the Planning Commission actually made some changes to the proposal that was brought before them to roll back some of those standards as well. And so, but I just wanted you to understand that when Keir was drafting those, the code that is before you now, he was going from the DLCD guidelines and following them pretty much verbatim, I think.
Okay. You know, a lot of my discussion is regarding what is happening in the urban transition in the River Road Santa Clara area, which is what I'm most attuned to. But there are other urban transition areas, Glenwood, for instance, you know, some fairly large areas. That so regarding the River Road Santa Clara area, the unincorporated area that's inside the UGB, are we at any point just deciding that the City of Eugene will set the standards for unannexed properties?
No, and that's what's coming before you as the next item, is we're bringing the code. So the county board adopts the code for the urban transition areas in the City of Eugene. And so you have the authority to craft that the way that you see fit.
Okay, I'll have more questions probably for months, maybe years to come. Because this is not something that we're throwing a switch and things are going to happen, but really it has a possibility of really adding a great many front doors, far less expensive than the $300,000 homes that are available today, or $1,600 a month two-bedroom apartments that are available today. You know, so, and that's what we're all interested in, is making certain that the people who want to live here because they graduated from high school here or because they just got a job here can live here. So, and it's all about adding front doors, and that's what that's why I'm so interested in ADUs. When it comes time to talk about ADUs in rural residential, then it'll be the same discussion then, is how do we add front doors? Thank you.
Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Kira, thank you for that, and appreciate that answer. I actually like the idea of adhering to really the DLCD standards. Frankly, I think that's where we should be, because we're a county. We're county government. And frankly, what this is, the ADUs, this is a tool for counties to participate in the housing issue. And that's how I look at this, because the reality is the responsibility is still and should absolutely still be on the cities. And that's where the ultimate responsibility should be. And frankly, what you're seeing now throughout the state and in different regions is these different no-growth policies are finally catching up and biting them in the tail end. That's what's happening here. Now, what we have here is having this tool where you have, and as Commissioner Farr pointed out, these urban transition areas, but you have this tool. And that, but isn't it only with the large populated counties right now?
I think it's all counties.
Is it all counties now?
No, it's not all. It's counties of 15,000 or more.
Yeah.
And cities of 2,500
Yep.
or more.
Yeah. So it's not all counties.
Shall.
So shall.
Yeah.
And that's the key word, shall. And what's the date on that again, Chair Bozovich?
July 1, 2018.
Here we go.
Yeah.
So we're at a crunch
like
time.
the present.
Yep, nothing like the present.
That's why it has the emergency clause on it.
I
don't like.
I like the idea of just making sure that we're within the guidelines. And again, this issue, the housing issue, should absolutely fall onto the cities, and that's where it belongs. And frankly, and I go back to House Bill 2007, the Great Divorce between Eugene and Springfield, and I will tell you that the original, I saw the original on that, is that they were calling for a significant amount of expansion of the urban growth boundary in Eugene to accommodate for housing. And as we all know, Envision Eugene did not get there, not even close. And of course, it only took a decade, which my understanding in Eugene, that's pretty fast. But anyway, sorry. But the reality is, I just think that really what you brought here on this issue, I appreciate it. Thank you for the work. But frankly, the standards and guidelines have been established. We're a county. And again, the responsibilities to the cities, this is a tool. And I'm glad that we have a tool. I'm glad we can participate, but that's really what it comes down to. So thanks for the work on this.
A decade is how many years I spent on the Eugene City.
So I have a quick question for council there. This was noticed as an and. Second, yeah, so am I holding joint hearings or separate hearings on both ordinances?
Yeah, you read in both ordinances, and the plan was to have a joint hearing for both ordinances
Okay,
at the same
I just wanted to get that clear before I open the hearing. So
Yeah.
if there's no other questions for staff, I will then open the public hearing on ordinance number 1805 and ordinance number 1806. And is there anyone signed up to speak on these two ordinances? I see somebody that wants to speak, so why don't you come on up, Bill? And these are the two that are the non-Eugene ordinances. No, I'm so sorry. Okay, I thought you wanted to speak on the Eugene one. I'm here for Eugene. Okay.
Okay.
These are the non-Eugene ordinances. So is there
non-Eugene.
somebody that wants to speak for the if you want to step up and state your name and where you're from for the record and have your piece, say your piece.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Sandy Belson. I am the planner for the City of Springfield. So I would like to point out one item, and I didn't have a chance to coordinate with Keir on this prior to your hearing, but the City Council last night approved the amendments, and in the amendments to the code to allow accessory dwelling units in the urban fringe, so the area outside city limits inside the urban growth boundary, included a recommendation from the Planning Commission that is not included in the ordinance before you. And so if you looked at section 3.3-825, additional provisions, paragraph D, we've added item 3, and that was basically to deal with a situation in the urbanizable area where you have larger properties, and to allow that those larger properties to be able to add an accessory dwelling unit. And so that paragraph reads, 1 or 2 accessory dwelling units may be built on medium and high-density zone parcels that, irrespective of the parcel size, could meet the necessary densities in the future as shown on a future development plan. So that future piece was important to both the planning commissions, the Lane County Planning Commission and the Springfield Planning Commission. So for those medium and high-density residential zoned properties, to have that. So I'll pass that over. Then there was also one other minor change, which doesn't really directly affect the urbanizable area, but applies to accessory dwelling units anywhere in the city or urban growth boundary. And that had to do with the gravel parking. So in some cases, we are allowing unpaved parking to reduce the cost. And so instead of referencing the engineering design standards, we just put in that it would need to be rocked. So we don't have that reference anymore. But I can answer any other questions about the Springfield process or what we allow for accessory dwelling units that would apply within the urban fringe in general. But just wanted to point out those two items.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking towards legal counsel here, and addition of language at this time usually requires another reading. And we are required to have 13 days between reading and passage of an ordinance, which puts us past July 1st. So is that language significant enough that we can't, that it's considered just a Scrivener's change, or is it significant enough it's going to require another reading? Because it sounds like a whole new section's being added.
Right. I'd say the parking was just a clarification in terms of a reference, but the third paragraph there is different.
Yeah, it wouldn't be Scrivener's, I think it would be substantive in nature. Couple of comments on that. Conceivably, if you wanted to read in verbatim the exact language here and where it goes in the draft code, that would probably suffice. In addition, if we did need to kick it out for another reading, we wouldn't make the July 1 deadline. But unless someone clues me in otherwise, I think if the county doesn't have code in place by the 1st of July, what happens is that the statutory imperative sort of overrides, and folks who are looking for an ADU approval would simply look to the authority of the statute rather than the code until the code is actually in place. So, and that's fairly typical.
So our first meeting in July is July 10th, which means we might have 10 days where somebody might apply for an ADU and fall under the statute versus the code we might adopt.
Correct.
Well, I think I might rush to make that window.
Yeah, and I think what the county would give up in that instance is that the sort of standards that you would want to apply from the county code wouldn't be operative at that point because you don't have county code that you're applying. And so some of the citing standard stuff wouldn't come in.
And in particular, in this instance where it's the Springfield UGB that would be affected, and this would only affect the second ordinance, not the first one.
Correct.
So we'd only have to come back for another reading on that ordinance, a third reading on 1806.
But a verbatim reading of the language should suffice.
A verbatim reading today would allow us to take action on the 10th.
That's right.
Right.
So somebody will have to provide the language up to whoever reads the motion. And I will have to do these in two separate motions because we'll be able to approve 1805 today because that hasn't had any changes and as publicized for the hearing. And as we were going to take action. So the only danger is in the Springfield UGB, somebody might apply for an ADU in those first 10 days, and some of these issues like providing a plan for the density that can be achieved in the future may not apply because we'll have to do another reading. But I can't see us not doing another reading because if we were to pass what we have today, it wouldn't be.
That's right.
It wouldn't match what the city's passed. So it'd be in conflict because the city amended their version of the ordinance and code last night.
Right, and I'll just say we're in somewhat of the same boat. We passed it last night, but it was not with an emergency clause, so that means it doesn't actually go into effect for 30 days. So we have this between July 1st and when our ordinance goes into effect of that little bit of a.
Oh, so we could actually beat you to the punch.
You could. And so we've decided that administratively we'll accept applications after July 1st and apply the rules that have been adopted. By the time they get issued, we'll have passed the ordinance.
Yep. Okay.
I mean, we'll have, the ordinance will be in effect.
All right, so I think that's probably procedurally where we'll have to go is whoever reads that for the second ordinance 1806 is going to need to read verbatim the changes the Springfield Council made, and we'll have to carry it to a third reading. Is there anyone else that wants to testify on the first two ordinances, 1805 and 1806? no one else wants to testify, I will close the public hearing and turn it over to the board for discussion and deliberations and possible motions. Commissioner Farr.
This feels very sloppy indeed. Somebody help me with that. Is it not sloppy? Am I missing something?
It's not as clean as we like things.
Right.
Yes.
Especially when it's land use, and we have Mr. Close sitting in the audience, for instance.
Yeah.
But that being said, I like the new language. It seems pretty amenable to allowing ADUs in a way that really allows them. And it's commendable also, and it's been stated not just here, but abroad, how Springfield is leading the way in facilitating the development of ADUs. And I personally thank you for that. But that being said, just being ahead, beating them to the punch doesn't make me feel any less antsy about this. So, but let's go ahead. I'm probably a yes on this.
Yeah. Well, I have to agree, it does feel a little bit messy, but part of that messiness was in the fact that the state first passed a statute that had a Scribner's error and then fixed it in the short session and kept the July 1st deadline. So we basically had from the short session to now to try and get 2 planning commissions and 2 city council and commissioners' approval, and the clock ran out on us. I mean, this is actually normal procedure to have to maybe go to another reading when there's a language change. It seems messy only because of the artificial deadline of July 1st.
Thank you. I'm off the ledge.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, this is the way we pass lots of land use stuff, is with an extra reading, with new language, and making sure we're careful in providing the 2 readings of an ordinance before we actually adopt it, with the 13 days between, as called for in our charter.
So, Mr. Chair, we want to take these, we're going to take them separately.
Yeah, we would,
Yeah.
we can actually
Okay,
approve the second reading and move to approve the ordinance on
Yeah.
1805.
Yeah.
Which covers all of the cities outside of the metro area that still have that are over 2,500
okay.
and still have areas of undeveloped UGB where they don't have coterminous city limits with their UGB, like Florence.
Right. So I do have one question, though, and that is, so where we are with Springfield not at an emergency, we're having to do another reading, and let's say somebody does come in to apply, what is that to stop from somebody to appeal without the language in place? From a legal standpoint, what would happen there?
If someone were to come in to apply with the language not in place, we would apply the statutory language directly.
And what if somebody then said, well, I'm going to appeal that?
Then you would measure the approval against the approval standards, which is the statute. There may be a question about, in this case, whether the city of Springfield wanted to apply certain citing standards, and I think the argument might be around that. That would be a difficult argument for the city in that case. But yeah, the standards would really just be the state statute at this point.
And I'll just add that, first of all, we have had no opposition to any of the ordinance language. And secondly, it's the city of Springfield that actually administers the code within the urban growth boundaries. So it would be the city making that land use decision and applying the statute. Yes.
Okay. All right. So, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
so I'd like to move approval of the, of ordinance 1805 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 10 to implement accessory dwelling unit standards within the urbanizing areas outside of the Metro Plan boundary as enabled by ORS 197.312 subsection 5, adopting the savings and severability clauses and declaring an emergency.
Second.
Been moved by Commissioner Lykin, seconded by Commissioner Farr to approve ordinance 1805. Discussion of the motion. So I want to spend a minute here to say that if it weren't for the fact that this was a statutory mandate, I would be voting against this motion, and I'll explain why. And I explained this to several legislators as they were thinking about adopting this statute way back in 2017. And in the short session, when I was asking for amendments, this is a wrong-headed place to add ADUs. The UGB area is supposed to be reserved to be annexed into cities and developed at urban density. And adding accessory dwelling units and making those properties more valuable is going to make it much more difficult for them to redevelop in urban standards. It's antithetical to why we have UGBs in a lot of ways. It's great that they mandated them inside of city limits. I have no objection to that and would have had absolutely no objection if they had put permissive language outside of UGBs. Because particularly if you look at a community like Mapleton, where there's lots of rural residential, single-family land, it could have added significant amount of housing inventory in an area that will never be urbanized and not prevent future urban level of density. So if you really think about this in a land use planning perspective, you are actually going to, one of the reasons why we're talking about having to do urban reserves in Eugene is how difficult it is to redevelop exception lands. Now you've just made those exception lands even more valuable and less likely to redevelop by adding this ADU issue to that area. I agree it's going to add front doors quickly, but in the long run, it may take front doors away by not allowing those lands to redevelop to urban standards, which should be even more dense than single family plus an ADU. So I would vote no against this, with the exception of the fact that this has been statutorily mandated by the state. So therefore, I'm going to vote yes in approval of it because we are a subdivision of the state, and I swore an oath to uphold state law. And in this case, I will, but on all three of these ordinances, that is my feeling. This is really the wrong direction to head. If I was sitting on a city council, I would be happy to adopt my inside city limits stuff. If the legislature listened to AOC and some other folks and allowed us to do it outside of UGBs, I would be very happy. But this one area, I think, is a place where we just are land use-wise setting ourselves up for failure by making it even harder to redevelop exception lands, and therefore ultimately impacting these important ag lands and forest lands that we were trying to preserve in this whole statewide land use scheme that no other states adopted. So I'm voting yes on this motion with protest, and I hope folks note that, and I hope maybe in the future the state might think about making it more permissive on the UGB portion, rather than a mandate. I do appreciate, as we get to the second motion, that Springfield's clarified that one of the things they're requiring on larger parcels is a plan to develop at urban standards, and showing that having the ADU put in place won't preclude that. I wish that we had that written into all three of these codes, well written into it. So, but it's also a difficult thing to review for, because when I think about Florence and some of their UGB, they haven't even really set some of the overlay densities on some of the properties. So how do you get a future development plan? So with that, if there's no further discussion, Commissioner Lycan.
Real quickly, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your comments, and just a real quick follow-up. I think what I'd like to do is compliment the professional staffs, first of all, Springfield, Lane County, on this. You deserve a lot of kudos here, because here's the reality, and we've been facing this now for quite some time. I would say 80% of the legislators up in Salem really do not quite understand land use law here in the state of Oregon. They don't get it. And I think that this is what happens when it's good intentions without understanding how Oregon land use really is. And this is what you get. Now, I will say in my city, I'm pretty fortunate because I have two legislators that actually do understand land use law, because they were, first of all, city councilors, mayor, So they understand that piece of it. But the vast majority, if you talk to legislators around the state, they don't get it. And that's really unfortunate. So kudos to our staffs. Lane County, kudos to Springfield staff. You deserve a lot of credit on this one to really work. And like I said before, this is a tool, but I think it's a tool that we have to be not all that flexible on. We have to really adhere. But the responsibilities lie within the cities. They truly do. So I appreciate your comment, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add a piece to that, so thank you.
Further discussion?
I'll refrain, thank you.
Okay. If there's no further discussion, this is an ordinance, so I'll call for the roll. Mr. Rickoff?
Commissioner Lycan,
Aye?
Commissioner Farr,
Aye.
Chair Bosevich,
Aye.
with Commissioners Williams and Sorensen excused. It passes 3-0.
Thank you. So ordinance 1805 passes, and that moves us on to ordinance 1806. Commissioner Lycan.
I think I've got it, so thank you, Kier. Mr. Chair, I'd like to move the second reading and set the third reading for July 10th, and public hearing,
No public.
no public hearing.
It doesn't need to be a time.
That's right, so no time certain on that. For July 10th, on ordinance number 1806, with the inclusion of section 3.3-825 subsection D, subsection 3, and this as follows. 1 or 2 accessory dwelling units may be built on medium and high-density zone parcels that, irrespective of the parcel size, can meet the necessary densities in the future as shown on a future development plan. That's the motion.
Was there another one about gravel there?
Do we need to add that? I don't think we need to add that.
Okay.
The gravel parking, wasn't that a Scribner's? Isn't that what you mentioned?
If we did, I apologize, I didn't catch that. I thought that was a clarification and was the way staff presented it.
Well, it's a change in the ordinance that the city adopted. It would apply everywhere, so I'm not sure that you need to, but that's up to your legal counsel. It doesn't apply specific to the urbanizable area. It's a citywide change.
It basically allows for gravel instead of a hard surface.
Right, we were allowing gravel anyway, that's not the change.
Yeah.
The ordinance as we had presented it would be a reference to our engineering design standards, and instead of referencing that, we just included the fact that you needed to have the gravel in the code language of 3/4 minus.
I think, as I understand it, that doesn't need to be
Okay.
included. It's not part of.
That's what I was wondering too.
Right. So that was the motion. Is there a second?
Second,
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Farr. Discussion of the motion.
the motion includes the language 1 or 2, and the state recommendation says at least 1. So so we're restricting it to no more than 2. Not that anybody might do more than 2, but
So in Springfield, for the properties that are zoned medium or high density, we would allow 2 accessory dwelling units if they can meet the minimum density standards.
and I guess by the letter that 2 is at least 1.
Right. So as you're saying, the statute requires at least 1. In low density, we would only allow 1. In medium and high density, you may be able to put in 2.
1, okay, all right.
Commissioner
Thank you
Lycan.
very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say thank you for adding both medium and high density. Frankly, if this tool is going to be used correctly, adding both to me is important. So I just want to say thank you on that. As I'm kind of reading through this and kind of gathering when that addition was put in place, and I was thinking through it, all the years I spent representing the city. I think this language is really good, and I just want to say thank you for that and allowing that to include that, because I think when you include both high and medium density, I think it allows for really an added benefit for the community on this particular issue. So thank you for that.
And while you're there, R1 is included in this. So
we don't call it R1,
we
but
don't.
R1 is
That's
what
the
is
difference.
Call
residential.
R1 in Eugene. Yeah. That's
Yeah, that's-
easier to understand.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
That's all I have.
That's a part of the next discussion.
And apologies for the messiness of the situation, but, I mean, as Commissioner Bozovich explained, we're under some unusual circumstances.
You don't have to apologize for anything for years to come. Good job.
No, and it's a good ad. It's a good ad.
Yep, thanks, Sandy. And I have to say, I do appreciate the part of this code where you do talk about on those medium and high that they have to submit the plan showing they can meet the ultimate density. Because that's a real key piece of this, I think, and what my greatest concern is with these ADUs and UGB. So I really appreciate that, Sandy.
Well, and that really came initially from your planning commission, and then our planning commission agreed, so here we are.
Good work.
We have good planning commissioners.
We do. We're pretty fortunate.
We really do. I can't appreciate our planning commission enough.
Top notch.
So with that, is there any other further discussion to the motion? This is just approving the second reading and setting the third, so we do not need to have a roll call on this. So I will do this by voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes 3-0 with Commissioner Williams and Commissioner Sorensen excused. So that gets us down to item 11C, which is the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 1804 in the matter of amending Lane Code, Chapter 10 and Chapter 9 of the UL Urban Land Eugene Code to implement ORS 1973125, adopting a savings and severability clause and declaring an emergency, county file number 509 PA 1804265. And we have Lindsay Eichner here today. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. So this is very similar to the proposal that you just were discussing, but specifically for the urbanizable land for the city of Eugene. And before I get into some of the differences in the proposals that you reviewed already, one thing that I want to clarify, because it came up at the Planning Commission and it's a constant source of questions, is how the IGAs differ between Eugene and Springfield. So Eugene, in the urbanizable area, you are the sole adopting body of those zoning ordinances. The city enforces them, but they don't co-adopt those zoning ordinances. The board is the sole decision-making body on those, where in Springfield, the IGA calls for co-adoption of the code. So I just wanted to kind of point that out at the very beginning because it is such a difference. So the city is not reviewing, the city council or the city planning commission is not reviewing these proposed amendments. Just the Lane County Planning Commission reviewed it through a public hearing and a second meeting for deliberations, and came to the proposed recommendations before you today. So some of those recommendations, we were working with code standards that are currently in Eugene City Code Chapter 9, and it's an older version than what the city uses in their city limits, because they've been constantly updating their codes, where we have not been updating the urban transition code. So there were standards in there for the R1 zoning, but it was a little bit of I don't want to say tease, but it's in there as a listed use, but it also, the requirement was to annex. And so then once you annex, then you would go to the newer version of Chapter 9. So we were working with the standards. The Planning Commission gave feedback that we were going to strike the language that the secondary dwelling be occupied by a property owner. That was in there originally, that's been stricken, and the requirement for off-street parking. has been stricken. And the requirement for annexation is completely off the table. The Planning Commission recommended that the secondary dwelling units be exempt from annexation, so not even require an agreement to annex in the future, which was the original proposal. So those are kind of the main changes that the Planning Commission discussed and felt strongly about. They are adding the use to all of the residential zones, where previously it was just going to be for the R1, the low-density residential zone. And I do have one recommended change to the proposal before you today. I've talked to Mr. Clark, and this specific change won't require a third reading. It's when the city adopted their version of the code, they changed the terminology from secondary dwelling unit to accessory dwelling. So I'm recommending that we change the definition and any reference to secondary dwelling to accessory dwelling. And because it doesn't change any of the standards that are in the
Not material, yeah.
yeah, it's,
And that makes it consistent with state language. Is that?
yes, it makes it consistent with state language. It makes it consistent for city staff who are administering multiple codes as well.
Okay.
So I'm happy to take any questions. I know there's,
Any questions for staff before we open the public hearing? Then I will open the public hearing on ordinance number 1804. And I assume, Mr. Close, you still want to address us on this one?
I do. As usual, I have 3 handouts. Short.
Thank you.
Bill Close, 375 West 4th Avenue, Suite 204 in Eugene, representing the home builders. And I have appeared in front of the Planning Commission at the county on this, and the Planning Commission and the City Council in the Eugene proceeding. If I could start with a response to Commissioner Bozovich's homily on how this could all been done better. I basically agree with you, having watched this whole process. First of all, I think that it makes rock-solid common sense to allow this kind of a boost in density in rural exception areas. Why not? I mean, they're already written off for resource purposes. It's a way of getting more people out there, but not on resource lands. It just makes sense all around the block, and maybe that'll happen sometime soon. We should be densifying the rural industrial and rural commercial too, but that's yet another story. The issue of whether this is a good thing to have in the urban growth boundary area, I certainly see that issue and sympathize with it. At one point, the Planning Commission was recommending that ADU proposals in the UGB area come with a shadow platting proposal to be sure that the densities could be increased in a sensible way when property ultimately comes into the city. That would have made good sense. I think that was in there. It was at least under discussion at some point. And you could still put that in if you wanted to. But I do understand your point about maybe this is not a good idea in the UGB, but the more important point is it's state law. And to reflect on state law a minute, this paragraph of state law really is a pretty dull axe when what we all need is scalpels. But I think it reflects a policy decision. I mean, this is the way this blind man would describe the elephant. I think the dull axe approach by the legislature reflects the legislature's intention to do something definitive for housing and to make it easy for local governing bodies who have constituencies that are kind of hostile towards new housing to turn to their constituencies and say, folks, we're stuck, we're in a corner, the legislature's making us do this, we just have to do it. I mean, in that respect, it's really a gift from the legislature to local governments. But Eugene did not take that gift and run with it. What Eugene did is Eugene said, I'm not sure what the dynamic was between the city council and the city staff. I mean, maybe the city councils let the city staff know that we are not prepared right now to back off on any of our restrictions in our current code on ADUs in order to come into compliance with state law. Or maybe the staff anticipated where the city council would be coming from and said to the city council, well, folks, you know, we don't have to roll back on any of our development standards that restrict ADUs in the city right now. We can do that later after we've spent 5 or 6 years out talking to the communities about the neighborhoods about what they want in the way of ADU regulations. We'll push that off down the road. Regardless, that's what the city has done. They really did not ease up on any of the development restrictions in the current code for ADUs. And as a result, we have really status quo ante. When you look at the new city code recently adopted, when you look at the new city code and you say, what's changed about ADUs in this code from before this new ordinance implementing this statute? What's changed is you can do ADUs in some zones where they weren't allowed before, but when you look at the nuts and bolts of how you do ADUs, nothing's easier. So in the current Eugene code, as amended to come into compliance with this ordinance, some neighborhoods are just too special to have ADUs. They're off limits.
Heard them.
There you go. Some lots of a certain shape are just too special to have ADUs. Certain lot sizes are not allowed to have ADUs. We have minimum lot sizes, and if you're below the minimum, you don't get one of these, even though state law says you're entitled to one. Then there's the issue of owner occupancy, a real bugaboo. In Eugene, before the state statute and after Eugene's implementation of the state statute, you still have to have owner occupancy if you want to have an ADU. So if you are a person whose retirement program is premised on having, 6 rental properties, residential, and you have a house on each of them, and you say, aha, here's my chance to put an ADU on each of those, make more housing for people, generate some more income. You can't do it in Eugene. They still have the owner occupancy requirement. So you can only build, if you have 6 lots, you can only build 1 ADU because you have to covenant that you're going to be living on that lot. And so the other 5 go undeveloped with the ADUs. That's Eugene today after implementing this statute, not in compliance with this statute. So that's a bit more of a riff on Eugene than I intended to make, but it feels good. The home builders have appealed the Eugene ordinances. And the merits of our appeal is simply going to be going through a list of restrictions on ADUs in the Eugene Code and why each of those restrictions is not a regulation relating to siting or design. And there's a lot of them. And that's just basically a shopping list to LUBA saying, you got to strike this ordinance down because it's not in compliance with state law. And let's say we win that 4 months down the road. It's not a hard target. Where are we then? Then we have no ordinances in Eugene, and we're back to status quo ante. And one of the commissioners might say, or the staff might say, well, you can just come in and rely on the state statute. Go in, apply for your ADU, show up at the building permit counter. What's the city going to do? Well, according to Springfield, they'll honor the statute. According to your staff, they should honor the statute. We know Eugene. They're going to honor the code. And that person's going to be sent away. And that person's going to either go to their land use attorney or their therapist. Actually, people are already showing up. If they go to their land use attorney, they're not going to have insurance, and they're going to spend a lot more money. And their land use attorney is going to say, oh, you got your building permit denied for your ADU in Eugene when the statute says you have an absolute entitlement to have one? Well, let's appeal that denial. Let's try to do an appeal to the Eugene hearings official because sometimes they give you that appeal. We'll go to a hearing. But they might not give you that hearing in front of the hearings official on the denial of that building permit, so you really need to go to LUBA. Got 21 days to do that. Please write your check for $400 and sign this attorney fee agreement. Oh, but this is a building permit denial. Maybe the appeal is really to circuit court. I don't honestly know. after having done it for 40 years. So we're going to go all three places. And that person's going to say, yikes, I'm going to my therapist because I can't afford to file 3 appeals over one crummy building permit. So that's going to be the ecology at the city of Eugene after LUBA says to the city, this is not okay. You're not in compliance with state law. We're remanding this ordinance back to you. And the city's going to say, oh, okay, thank you for the remand back. And nothing's going to happen. So the second piece of our, because LUBA's not going to say you have to go do X, much less X in a certain period of time. So the other half of what we're going to do is we're going to file a petition for enforcement with the Lcdc, because we're allowed to do that under state law. And we're going to say to the commission, hey, look, this statute was aimed at cities like Eugene that are basically hostile to housing, and these people are not in compliance. And under this statute, we have a right to come here and ask you for an order telling them what they have to do and when they have to do it in order to come into compliance. So that's the second half of how we get enforcement, get residents of Eugene the benefit of this statute. So that's coming sooner rather than later. But the first step is getting into LUBA on that 21-day deadline, and we've done that. I'm still talking about Eugene. I apologize. This ordinance that's in front of you now is 10 times better than it was when it was presented to you by the City of Eugene staff. Because when it was given to you by the City of Eugene, it looked just like the Eugene Ordinance. It was terrible. And that between the competent work of your staff and the sharp eyes of the Planning Commission, they shook about 95% of the junk out of it. And as best I can tell, there's only one problem with it remaining, which is still a significant problem, and that is the minimum lot size requirement. So I flagged that in my letter to you, the italics language on the first page there. It says, for attached secondary dwelling units, the code says, quote, except for flag lots, the lot shall be at least 4,500 square feet. Flag lots shall contain at least 13,500 square feet to permit a secondary dwelling. And then another part of the code says, for detached secondary dwelling units, the code says, except for flag lots, the lot shall be at least 6,000 square feet. Flag lots shall contain at least 13,500 square feet. So there are minimum lot size requirements in the UGB for getting your secondary dwelling unit. Better to call them ADUs, and that's what you're going to do. That's not consistent with state law. The state law allows regulation of siting and design. The minimum lot size requirement goes to whether you can develop, not how you develop. Siting and design goes to how you develop. So this minimum lot size requirement is contrary to state law, and we have to target it in order to be consistent with what we're doing in Eugene, because it's in Eugene code too. This was the subject of some discussion at the Planning Commission. We're listening to the discussion of the Planning Commission, and I saw a groundswell of movement to go to a minimum lot size, and despite my best body language from the audience, they kept the language in there. But I think it needs to come out, and it's a simple thing to pull out, and if you pull that out, then I think your ordinance will be in compliance with state law. Failing that, then this ordinance has to be appealed as well, and you'll be in the soup with the City of Eugene, or at least the county toll will be in the soup with the City of Eugene, because there's this one problem with the code. So that's kind of the big picture. I rambled on longer than I wanted to, but I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Have any questions for you, Bill? I might have some for staff.
Okay, thank you. I'm not going anywhere, I'll be here.
Yep. So is there anyone else that wishes to speak to Ordinance 1804? Seeing and hearing none, I will close the public hearing and turn to the board for discussion, deliberations, and a possible motion. So I'll get us going, because I'm going to ask a question about minimum lot size here. Striking that language out of the ordinance, is that a substantive material change that will require another reading, or is that just getting rid of language and doesn't require another hearing?
The latter, yeah, that's been our interpretation for a while, that by deleting language out, it's not a substantive change.
Okay.
It doesn't prevent adoption.
Right, so I just want to make that, then the secondary question I have as I'm looking at my planning staff is there language within this code that speaks to minimum setbacks from property lines and minimum setbacks between buildings if they're detached, if it's a detached and all that. Is that still there?
Yes, there are still setback standards. There is also a height standard if the structure is so close to a specific distance to the property line setback. There's a height standard that was already in the code.
So I'm just,
But yes, there are setbacks that are consistent. The setbacks are actually less than a main dwelling.
Which would be considered design standards. I don't think there's any.
right, and that's what I was getting at. But when you get down to it, if a lot's too small and there's a fairly large existing dwelling unit on it, you're not going to meet those setbacks. So, yeah, the question about having a minimum lot size, I think, is somewhat irrelevant because it gets to a point where you're not going to meet setbacks if you get below a certain size lot. I'm not quite sure why they needed such a huge flag lot. That's just,
Yeah, it's an older city standard.
Yeah.
I do want to point out that I did, that this, like Mr. Close said, it wasn't one of the items that the Planning Commission took issue with and had us remove, but I did not a completely thorough, but a fairly extensive review of our GIS map of the city of Eugene and the unannexed properties. And there's probably 2 or 3, or maybe a handful of parcels that are long, skinny strips that are under the 6,000 square foot, but they're going to be too narrow to develop in the first place.
the minimum setbacks are going to get you.
And there was less than 5 flag lots that are under the 13,500 square feet. I understand the argument of being in compliance with the statute, and that's our goal, but I just wanted to bring that up, that there's less than 5. I found 3. I'm going to give a little bit of buffer room. There might be a handful of them.
Which means that if we were to strike the language, it's not going to have a very much impact. And if we strike the language, we will prevent an appeal based on the fact that we're throwing a non-citing standard in to our ADU statute that was required by state law. So, it's like minimal impact, probably really covered by setbacks anyway. Seems to me there's no reason not to pull that language out of the ordinance and pass it without that language, because it really has almost zero effective impact because of the setback requirements, fire code requirements for separations between buildings, everything else you think about that would kind of make it that you have to have a fairly decent sized lot to get a separate dwelling unit, and even if you're going to bump out for an attached, you still got to have a fairly decent sized lot to maintain those setback requirements. So I would kind of urge whoever makes the motion maybe to think about doing it without that, with pulling that language around minimum lot size.
And excuse me.
Okay.
So the 2 sections that would be Chapter 9.2741, subsection 2A, item 2, and 2B, item 1
Okay.
would be the 2 places.
As referenced in Mr. Close's letter.
Yeah,
He's got the
I'm
actual
looking at my
section.
draft. Okay, he's got it in there. Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
He did a thorough job.
He sure did. Okay, yep,
And
perfect.
as you reminded me of something else I wanted to tell Bill. My sister's a psychiatrist. I think the therapist fees would actually be higher than the attorney's fees for doing the 3 appeals, but that's besides the point.
Because it would take years.
Commissioner Lyken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm comfortable with removing that language. And there's a couple, if you look at a significant reason why, when we went through the first process with the city of Springfield, I feel like Lane County was actually getting a partner. And if you look at the differences here, we got a partner with the city of Springfield. This second time with Eugene, not so much. And so I think that we need to, from my perspective, the language really needs to be in place because the county is going to be taking much more of the lead on this process, comparatively speaking, with the city of Springfield. So I think that if we can have it match up to what Lane County, what we're most comfortable with, and really, again, as I stated before, adhering to what the state has brought forth, that's where I come down on. Now, I wanted to go first because that's really all I have to say. And Commissioner Farr, I think, is going to probably elaborate much more on this because when it comes to Eugene, he's been so bashful about his opinions on this. And so I'm looking forward to that. But that's really where, and so, Mr. Close, I appreciate the fact you'll make it very simple by noting the where it is within the code, and excuse me, put my glasses on, where it is with the within our code. So appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Farr?
Thank you. Well, you know, I do say quite a bit about this, about ADUs and other housing types, and I'll restate why. Because we have an emergency, a crisis regarding housing, and I will add the caveat that adding ADUs to our inventory is not going to solve the problem. It's solving the problem to make certain that young people can get homes, making sure that some of the people who are currently homeless or bordering on homeless can get homes, making certain that people who graduate from high school and want to stay living in our community can get homes. All of that is important, and I've said that over and over again, and I don't need to rehash that. So when I ask the questions, it really is designed to make certain that we all understand why this law is going to take effect on July 1st. And you know, DLCD, once again, it's not the law. As housing prices are in Oregon are going up, outpacing employment and wage growth, the availability of affordable housing is decreasing in cities throughout the state. So it goes on and on with the preamble to talk about why we need to add new front doors and add places for innovative and different sorts of places for people to live. That's the only reason I'm pushing this. It's not because I dislike the city of Eugene. I don't. I lived there for a lot of years, decided to spend the rest of my life here. And I don't dislike the Eugene City Council. I wouldn't have been reelected several times if I did dislike the Eugene City Council. But really, what I do dislike is, and I'm going to quote here, a city that is hostile to housing development. Now, I'm not sure who said that. Oh, I am. I'm pretty sure who did say that. But it's something that I've thought all along, is that the city of Eugene seems to be hostile to housing development. And as we look at the difficulty that they seem to have in making the prescribed recommended changes to allowing ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, or it feels like Eugene is, for some reason, being hostile. And I sat in the room 6 weeks ago, however long it was ago, and the neighborhood council came up and one by one talked about why we should just slow down. We don't need to add these quickly, and we, in particular, don't need to add them in my neighborhood because my neighborhood's fine just the way it is. You know, they all supported ADUs. They all supported adding lower-priced housing. But you know, let's just make sure it's not next door to me. Is what it really sounded like, and that's a uniform approach to any changes. We're seeing it in Bethel right now when we're trying to add housing for homeless high school kids. People don't want these things in their backyard, but we can't afford that. We cannot afford to not make what sometimes seems like a sacrifice. It changes our neighborhood a little bit. Maybe there's a little bit more traffic in the neighborhood. Maybe there are more people walking through the neighborhood. But we need to force the issue and make certain that we do every single thing that we can possibly do to add more housing in as economical a fashion as we possibly can. And ADUs if they're not overly restricted, then it can do that. So, looking at the lot sizes, the DLCD says that there shouldn't be a minimum lot size, period. That you should look at your setbacks, and if setbacks seem to be restricted, then review your setbacks and take a look and make certain that your setbacks aren't too restrictive. I mean, they're even going that far as to taking a look at adjusting the setbacks that you require inside the city. Now, my question is, has the city of Eugene really pushed it as far as they possibly can in what's called R1 to allow for people to add ADUs? Well, it doesn't seem like it to me. For instance, let's go back to some of the questions. Owner occupancy. The LCD suggests that owner occupancy is not an issue, that the lot doesn't have to be owner occupied. What is the city of Eugene saying about that?
For this proposal, we struck that requirement.
So so by voting yes on this, owner occupancy is not required
Correct.
in the urban transition.
Correct.
How about inside the city limits of Eugene, which we have less say on?
I don't know what was adopted and
It's
with their
still required.
standards.
What about off-street parking? You answered that earlier.
We struck the requirement for off-street parking.
Okay. And the lot size that the EC 9.274 items, we're taking care of that by reading that in.
So kind of backwards, what requirements are being left in are an 800 square foot size maximum. And let's see, for a detached, that's the only requirement for an attached structure besides meeting normal setbacks that a dwelling would have to meet or an accessory structure would have to meet. And then for a detached structure, we're asking that there be a primary entrance for the secondary dwelling. And then this was left in from previously, the outdoor storage and garbage areas are screened. But I don't think that's really affects the siting of one, or even the placement or the location or the approval or denial of this accessory unit.
So we're confident that an ADU could be developed on any legal lot or parcel, as long as it meets setback requirements. And if setback requirements are onerous, then we'll review the setback requirements.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then if they can't meet the setback requirements, they could do one within the existing primary dwelling.
And the one that I like is what I've seen quite often is compatible in character requirements. And those are all stricken. Okay. Now, one last question that I do have then, and that is when I heard the deliberations, and I've not been listening to the Eugene City Council since then, they were passing, they were legalizing ADUs on R3, 4, and 5, right?
Correct. So from what I understand, so some of the additional changes in here are to zones, neighborhood, special area zones that don't apply in the urban transition area, but because we were making changes to the zones that do apply, the city staff suggested that we bring those, we just try to, in increments, bring the codes to make them a little bit more similar, bring them up to date. So, yeah, I think they were doing it for all of the R1 through R4, but I did not follow what the final city council outcome was.
Initially, R1 wasn't included in the discussion.
It's because it was already allowed.
It's already allowed with some pretty severe restrictions. Mm-hmm. And those restrictions, we believe, are all being eased.
I don't know what's happening within city limits, again, but those very strict regulations that were in effect were never in effect in this area. The board never adopted those same standards. They're fairly new. These standards were adopted in the early 2000s.
Okay. I remain frustrated, but it's not by your work, by any stretch of the imagination. And I'd like to also commend you on your work on the River Road Santa Clara Refinement Plan. That's not what it's called, the Neighborhood Development Plan. You're pretty deeply involved in that, and I think that some of the changes that we need to make regarding residences are going to happen through that process. So thank you for that work. So, Mr. Chair, that being said, I really have no further questions at this point in time. I remain disappointed that it takes so long to make some things happen, and I remain disappointed that the city of Eugene continues to have its reputation for being hostile to housing development, and then we wring our hands saying, why don't we have more houses? And we remain hostile to housing development. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I have at this point in time.
So with that, is there someone that would like to make a motion on ordinance number 1804? Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move approval of ordinance 1804 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 10 and Chapter 9 of UL Urban Land Eugene Code to implement ORS 197.312 subsection 5, adopting a savings and severability clause and declaring an emergency with the added, or with the deletion of, deleting EC 9.2741 subsection 2 and subsection A. 2. That's what I had. Is that right?
Actually,
Is that it?
yeah, EC 97241, 2A2, and
Oh, and excuse me, and EC 9.2741 subsection 2 subsection B1. All right, thank you. Did I get that right?
The code sections, yes. I had also recommended for your consideration of changing all the terminology from secondary dwelling to accessory dwelling.
Okay,
with that change.
so we'll just add the change as presented by staff.
Second.
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Farr to adopt ordinance number 1804, removing sections EC 9.2741 2A2 and EC 9.2741 2B1, and to revise all references from secondary dwelling units to accessory dwelling units throughout the document. And is there any discussion to the motion? Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And, by doing this, the county kind of avoids the appeals that the city will be going through. So that's my understanding. So I'm pleased to be moving forward with this. I hope that we can keep an eye on how it actually does affect the applications for adding front doors. And excited about the prospects of, the county maybe catching up with Springfield at some point. But really, we'll keep an eye on what happens inside the city of Eugene. It's important that in whatever way we can, we make certain that compliance is happening in the city of Eugene and that barriers are removed at every opportunity that we possibly can remove barriers. We'll keep an eye on that. So, thank you.
Further discussion of the motion? So I won't repeat my monologue on UGBs and exception lands and annexation, but I will say, Commissioner Farr points out a good thing, which is accessory dwelling units are going to help with our housing crisis, and we truly are in a housing crisis, but it's not the ultimate solution. It's going to provide some of it. But I look to things like the Cannery Station project down in Florence, where they're proposing a whole bunch of units right at Munsell Lake and 101 in a big planned development, and the Lombard Apartments on River Road, where we're going to get some 95 additional units. Those are being questioned by neighbors heavily, just like ADUs in the Jefferson West Side neighborhood are. So every time we have possible solutions, we're looking at opposition from folks that are afraid of the change. And I look at places like Bascom Village, where there was considerable concern about change in those neighborhoods. It was the first, affordable housing out there in that neighborhood, and they filled Sheldon High School, how many times? 3 times?
3 times.
Yeah, for hearings and all. And today, if you walk around the neighborhoods surrounding that development, there's virtually no one that has had any of their fears live out.
One person.
Yeah, well, there's always one. But really, it's that fear of change usually that leads people to object to housing projects. And we have to stop giving into that fear. And adding these accessory dwelling units as part of this motion and doing so in a least restrictive way, I think is one of those ways we can get beyond that fear of change and strike at the heart of a real issue for this country and this county and this community, which is the lack of housing and lack of housing supply at all levels. So this is one piece of that puzzle. Some of these, large multifamily projects are another piece. Projects like our MLK supported housing are another piece of the puzzle. But it's all got to work together, and hopefully we'll get past the fear people have of change and work towards expanding the housing supply here. So I'll be looking forward to voting in favor of the ordinance. Any other discussion of the motion? Seeing and hearing none, this is an ordinance, so I'll call for the roll. Mr. Rickoff?
Commissioner Lycan.
Aye.
Commissioner Farr.
Aye.
Chair Bosevich.
Aye.
With Commissioners Williams and Sorensen excused, that it passes 3-0.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody, and thank you, staff.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for keeping us on the straight and narrow. I'll send you my therapist bill. So that finishes up all the regularly scheduled business. I'm going to call for other business before we go to review of assignments. Is there any other business for the board? Commissioner Lycan, as he's trying to find the email.
I got it. So thank you, Mr.
We have an action item coming out of executive session.
Yep. So thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the item coming out of executive session. So, Mr. Chair, I move that Lane County Counsel Stephen Dingle be authorized to complete whatever process is legally necessary for Lane County to opt into the class action litigation, Kane County, Utah, and all similarly situated plaintiffs versus United States Court of Federal Claims case number 17-1739C-17-1991C.
Second.
So it's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Farr, to authorize Mr. Dingle to participate in this, have Lane County enter into this class action suit. For those of you that are listening in the audience, this is a suit by a county in Utah against the United States for shorting counties on their payment in lieu of taxes, known as PILT. And it looks like Lane County may gain $25,000 by participating as part of this class. We have to opt in to this. It's not like a typical class action where we have to opt out. We have to actually opt in. That's why we have to take this vote, and it won't cost the county anything to participate in this class. That we only stand to benefit to correct some numbers errors by the federal government in calculating their PILT payments. So any other discussion to the motion from the board? Any questions for staff about the motion? Seeing and hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes 3-0 with Commissioners Williams and Commissioner Sorensen excused. So with that, then we'll move on to, we already held our executive session, move on to review of assignments. Mr. Rickoff.
Chair Bosevich, Commissioners, I believe I have 2 items. One is the Armory at MLK, and that is in finding the best possible uses for the Armory, we need to fast track an understanding of limitations and restrictions for that use, and that should be the first order of business in pursuing that. So the action for staff is to understand the restrictions and how they apply in limiting
I assume
activity.
there'll be some kind of report back to the board once that
Right.
research is complete.
Correct. Those restrictions in terms of not only, what's hard and fast, as well as what might be done to overcome restrictions should we desire to move forward. The other item I have is returning Ordinance 18-06, amending Chapter 10 to the July 10th meeting of the Board of County Commissioners.
And there was an assignment given to county council on the workforce partnership.
Yes, there was.
Yeah.
And actually, I've seen a fair amount of correspondence between Commissioners Sorensen and the Workforce Partnership with Mr. Dingle included in that. That will we'll continue to pursue that. That is, in terms of understanding, a recent requirement by the state of Oregon for the board members to sign a waiver regarding confidentiality. So that is being fully explored. I'll clean up the language and make sure that's tracked accordingly.
Yeah, just want to make sure it gets on the
I appreciate
task assignments. Anything else that he missed?
Nope.
Is there any other business for the board today? Then we are adjourned. Thank you.